Chilaga, or Chicago as its modern name is. A bustling American modern city. We see all its immense activity and its varied, strange art with its modern buildings that don't seem to convey a sense of inspiration. And yet when we look deeper into Chicago or Chilaga, we still see signs of what it used to be. An incredible old world architecture, evident in the great pillars and the remaining buildings. There's a deeper story behind Chicago, or Chilaga. We recall the Great World's Fair that occurred in Chicago. Why was it in Chicago? What's so special about this city and its location? Why is it we have Ferris wheels that don't match the Ferris wheel that we built in the World's Fair of 1893? Where does the name Chilaga come from? We look at older maps and we know that the origin of Chicago was that it was originally land settled by Native Americans, and then after the war, the Northwest Indian War, in the early 19th century, the United States took over the land and built what was called Fort Dearborn. And the amazing city of Chicago arose in that century. Yet why, when we look at old maps, we see a city named Chilaga and no Great Lakes around it? Did the cartographers at the time have no idea what they were doing? Did people simply go out and explore and they were lost and they never came back? All of our ancestors were just fools? How did they survive, and how did they manage to build this incredible city in a nation that they had built out of a wilderness, so the official narrative tells us? There's so much more to this story when we look at the old bird's eye views of Chicago or Chilaga. We see a strange contradiction to what we're told. It always appears that by the mid-19th century or the 1860s, the city was already built out. Large buildings and bridges and incredible industrial capacity. Of course, we'll be told that the city had to expand for the Civil War, that there were other reasons for it. And yet these achievements are extraordinary and they defy simple explanation. We look and we see so many well-built buildings that are large and varied and spread across terrain. How was this achieved? We understand that the infrastructure was limited. There were minimal roads. The Transcontinental Railroad was not completed. Yet somehow they managed to quickly build many roads and lay out the great city of Chicago. In this other bird's eye view from 1868, 3 years before the Great Fire, we see a very well-developed city with many large buildings and bridges and industrial capacity, somehow built from nothing, just over 50 short years, when it started out as just a small fort with just a wall around it, to this, and it didn't even take them 75 years. This is what we're told Chicago looked like when it was Fort Dearborn. It was burned down by a Native American raid during the War of 1812 and then quickly rebuilt. And then just think, just over 50 years later, built out to that incredible bird's eye view of a city we just saw. But this was its modest beginnings. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. What's really the story behind Chilaga? Was this incredible city really built just over 50 short years? Burned down in 1871 and then quickly rebuilt again? This is just one of the remarkable buildings that we have that existed before the Great Fire. We see an architecture that shows a unique building technique. Something that we don't even see in our modern architecture, and we're given simple explanations that we prefer a brutalist architecture now. We don't like artistic domes or towers or spires or cupolas with clocks on them. That's from the times of the past. In our modern times, we prefer buildings that don't have these appearances to them. We don't like domes, we don't like cupolas, we don't like amazing window dressings, we don't like building with granite and solid materials, and most importantly, we don't like building stairs that go up to the second floor for some inexplicable reason. Yet that's what we see in all these buildings from this time frame, from the mid-1800s. And yet in this other photo, which supposedly predates the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, we see many of the same things. An existing bridge, smokestacks, other large buildings, aspects that defy simple explanation. How is this achieved with just a horse and buggy culture? Yet it's the same explanation that they had labor, that they pulled it off the street. They had many immigrants to the United States. One thing they'll never try to tell us, though, is that the Native Americans are responsible for any of these buildings. That's something we'll never hear. The only thing we're told that they built were great mounds that just kind of resemble pyramids. And yet when we look at things such as the Chicago Water Tower, we wonder who exactly built this and how did they do it? The water tower is an extraordinary structure. Very tall and built out with ornate detail, yet supposedly done with bricks and done during a time when there was limited capacity with heavy machinery. Oh yes, we have the explanation with the labor explanation. But even looking at the houses, we see multiple chimneys, we see domes on just simple houses. Again, this picture was from before 1871. Barely 50 years after the city's humble beginnings as a fort. Because we're told that this did not exist as a city or even really a settlement until after 1800. And yet we see all these incredible achievements. These castles, these turrets, these smokestacks. All this ornate detail with these large blocks. Then the 1871 fire in Chicago occurred. Strangely enough, there was a large fire that occurred on the same line of latitude to the north in Wisconsin called the Peshtigo Fire. Yet we're told it's a separate event, even though it occurred on the exact same day as the Great Chicago Fire. We see the destruction, and we wonder about this kind of architecture. Columns, pillars, large blocks. Wouldn't it make more sense if a fire had destroyed wooden buildings? And yet we see the strange diagonal cuts, and yet ornate detail in architecture and the structural foundation of the building that doesn't make a lot of sense, especially with the tremendous rubble. What really happened? Even now we're given conflicting accounts as to how this fire started. We're told that it was a cow. We're told, well, perhaps there was some aspect of the Peshtigo fire up in Wisconsin that came down and affected Chicago and Illinois. But how is it really possible? Yet again, we see the contradictions with the narrative. Amazing buildings with brick and large blocks reduced to rubble. In the background, we see other large buildings. What exactly were these large buildings made of? And yet you see a smokestack in the background as well. It just paints a conflicting picture, and it's one of the reasons why what you look at with your eyes doesn't match the narrative. And here's another fine example. What's with these electric-looking trolley cars that are being pulled around by horses? What came first? Were these cars simply left in the city to be found, and the only means they had to move them around was by horses? And if that wasn't the case, why would you build large, heavy cars like this? Why wouldn't you just build something smaller or lighter with just some sort of canopy over it? It'd be lighter for the horses, and you would save a lot of labor on the animals and get more out of the animals. And looking at other pictures of the destruction of Chicago from the 1871 fire, we see more evidence of the rubble. And yet, you can see power lines, and even though power wasn't supposed to exist and we're told it's telegraph, and yet here we see another large, incredible building that just doesn't make sense. Again, ornate detail on the windows, maybe 4 stories, perhaps more. And if you look carefully, you'll see other evidence of many lines going into it. Just so many things that don't make sense. This was 1871. What was really the cause of this fire? What really happened here? Did Sherman's army make a wrong turn and come up to Illinois to destroy Chicago after Atlanta? Did Sherman's march go all over the place? Yet these photos of destruction look very similar to the photos of destruction we saw in the Confederacy during the United States Civil War. And here it is again. Another smokestack that just seems to have been left all on its own, not damaged by the fire, and yet other large buildings reduced to complete rubble. Total destruction as though the land was swept clean. Yet some buildings were spared. What do you think was the forces that caused this kind of destruction? What could have done this? Was it just a fire? Or was there something more behind this? And finally, we see the remnants of what appear to be churches, or what we're told were churches. Yet it's these kind of photos and these kind of stories that cause us to question the narrative. This is the very foundation of this research. Because what we're shown in these images don't match what we're told happened. Now, of course, we could always try to explain these images as being the result of some sort of computer-generated images, or what we would now call AI photos. But we've always been told these stories in this historical account on Chicago. Yet even more extraordinary was Chicago's rapid recovery after the 1871 fire. The city was quickly rebuilt, and by 1893 it was ready for the World's Fair, the first of the great World's Fair. Building a Ferris wheel that was supposed to quote-unquote out-Eiffel the Eiffel Tower, with the capacity to carry many people. And over 100 people in each one of these carriage cars, or really a little mobile home, put up on a Ferris wheel. And yet we've never built a Ferris wheel that large since. I think it's really the construction and the establishment of this Ferris wheel that tells us that there's a lot more going on, regardless of what we think of the story behind the World's Fair. Told that all the buildings were built with temporary construction techniques and stucco and painted with white plaster. And yet at the same time they also built this extraordinary Ferris wheel of a size that's not been equaled since. And you look at the foundation of the Ferris wheel and the basic machinery. How was this manufactured, and how were these pieces transported? You even look at the centerpiece of the Ferris wheel, the size behind it. Yet we'll never see any photos that show us how exactly this was manufactured or even transported. It looks like they moved it around on rails. But what was really the situation behind it? How did they put it in place? Was it really that easy for them? And if it was, then why don't we build a giant Ferris wheel now? You think it would be an incredible tourist attraction, and if it brought millions of people to Chicago in the 1890s when transportation was much more difficult, think of what it could do for a city now if they were trying to bring in revenue or just attract tourism. The construction of this Ferris wheel is something that, again, defies simple explanation. Did these people really achieve this with the means available to them, or at least the means that we're told were available to them? I think this is the very example of evidence that shows us that either there was technology available to these people that they weren't supposed to have, or there's another story. And yet we didn't leave this Ferris wheel standing. It was supposedly destroyed with dynamite, as the entire World's Fair of 1893 was just wrecked and left as a pile of junk, with the exception of just a few buildings. It just doesn't make any sense, and how would you destroy a Ferris wheel like that with simple dynamite? The legacy of the 1893 World's Exposition in Chicago, which started the legacy of World's Fairs. We also suspect and believe, and we have a lot of evidence, that the whole point behind this Columbian Exposition, as they called it, was to establish a set of societal norms for what seems to be a new society that was established from one that didn't exist before. We see all the detail in these incredible buildings that we're told were temporary, and yet somehow this attracted people from all over the lands, not just the United States, but across the whole world. The Columbian Exposition has been covered in excessive detail by many other researchers, but I think it adds another piece of evidence to the story behind Chicago, or Chilaga. If these buildings were already there, and if they already existed, along with other evidence that we have of extraordinary technology and achievements, then this is the evidence that shows us that there was a civilization that existed. We consider the Chicago Federal Building. This was not part of the Chicago World's Fair. Another 1890s building that in its size and opulence defies simple explanation. Of course, it has all the construction cues that we see, incredible pillars and columns, and just a size that matches what we've seen in state capitals. we were able to build this way so easily in the 1890s. We could leave this incredible edifice with a dome and a cupola. Again, this gives us inclinations of a state capitol. And yet there seems to be something missing from the top. Why isn't there a spire or even a quote-unquote weather vane, which we're told that buildings needed at that time? And yet you look at other buildings around it and they defy easy explanation too. Apparently there were photos that came up later of the construction of this cupola or dome once this building became the subject of research. And we have to wonder about the veracity of this photo. Something about it just doesn't feel exactly right. We have the classic vanilla sky, and we have people just posing on the top of the tower. And as this building has drawn more attention, we understand that it was destroyed during the period of urban renewal in the 1960s, a great tragedy with its loss. Yet the symbols and the presence of it remain. They remain as part of our research and our understanding that this building really did stand. And yet it had symbols of eagles that didn't seem to match what we're told were the traditional American eagle. The eagle's a very interesting symbol in and of itself, and we have to wonder if it reflects back to a time past. And this was the Chicago Federal Building's predecessor, built well before 1890, supposedly in the 1860s, 1870s. We're also told that pieces of this building, columns, although you'll see that there's really no columns evident, were shipped up north to Wisconsin and Milwaukee to take part in the building of an incredible basilica after this building was torn down. Although when you look at the plans on the outside and the inside, you'll see that there were no columns. There's also the gilded mansions, many of which still stand in Chicago, that give evidence of a civilization past, because this does not look like a house that was built in the 19th century, and this is certainly not a house that we would be capable of building now with this kind of construction detail. Why would anyone need such an opulent, ornate house at that time? We have to realize that this was very likely built by a different civilization with completely different capabilities. Or we have to accept the fact that our civilization did have capabilities that we didn't understand. Even looking at the interior, we see incredible detail, beyond which we see in all of our residences since. When you look around and you see how these rooms are decorated, even looking at the ceiling with beautiful ornate detail, how difficult was it to do this? Yet we see it in so many of these buildings and so many of these gilded mansions. It paints a completely different picture than what we're told or what we're expecting to find in these older houses. We certainly don't see decorative details like this in our modern houses. Just get your sheetrock out and just have your standard building materials, and lo and behold, voila, you'll have a $750,000 house that, if you're lucky, might last 40 years. Yet there's other buildings that still stand and give the explanation of a possibility of unique building methods that existed long before we're told the Chicago World's Fair happened. Other buildings that show a combination of construction methods where we see the same scaling mentality with the columns and the pillars, as though they were all prefabricated and just waiting to be put as part of the building. Yet you look down and you see the doorways with the arches and the combination of blocks. And this building also does paint that picture where you see the different scales behind the columns, looking down at the base and then looking at the columns as part of the upper 3 to 4 floors. Certainly this is not a construction type that we do today. And finally, we'll see that it seems as though they did get the electric cars running again in Chicago. And strangely enough, you'll see electric trolley cars across every small town in the Midwest United States. Why would a town of 5,000 to 7,000 people even need an electric trolley car? Again, it's something that defies simple explanation. And yet we see photographic evidence of it. And while we can certainly account for the fact that some photos could have been generated, could all these photos have been generated? You go to your library and you do this kind of research and you'll see all these small towns had electric trolley cars. Photos from Chicago from the 1930s and 40s still depict a skyline that shows an old world city. Buildings that were supposedly from the Art Deco period, and yet again they're more beautiful and ornate with more artistic flair in them than modern buildings. And compare and contrast this with the skyline that we started the video with, looking at Chicago. Which buildings are prettier? Which buildings look like they took more effort and more architectural prowess in their construction? Those are all questions I leave to you to answer. What do you think's the real story behind Chicago? Or Chilaga? Where do you think this incredible store, or do you think this incredible city? Thank you for joining me for this exploration into Chicago or Chilaga, a great old world Tartarian city. As always, ask questions, explore yourself, and you'll restore the world. Please like, comment, and subscribe.